Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the second show in our Torch to Tunis series. And we have a return guest. Dave Roberts was on earlier talking about the 30 AU, but today we're focusing on their role in the North African campaign. And I'm delighted to bring Dave in now. And before I do, if you're new to the channel, a few new subscribers over the last few days, which is fantastic. If you always wonder where to get more information, it's in the description on YouTube. That's where you'll find links to books, to websites, to the resources. That's where everything is. I often get asked, where can I find this? Where can I find that? Everything is always in the description below. So anyway, without further ado, I'll bring Dave in. Good evening, Dave. How are you today?
Evening, Paul. Good. Thank you. Yeah.
So since the last time you were on, you've had a few more contacts. People have, come to you, forward to you, even via World War II TV. So before we talk about what you're talking about today in North Africa, there's obviously still information surfacing about this unit.
There is, and it just amazes me that it keeps on coming out and people reaching out through World War II TV. We've just had the 100th birthday of Tom Bonham, who's the last survivor. But I always say last with a bit of a caveat that we thought we'd lost the last before we found Tom, and then we found another. So who knows? But I know there is more to come, which is one of the reasons why I love this unit.
Well, exactly, and it's there's another SAS book on the horizon, and Damien Lewis comes on my channel. We're talking about them, and Ben McIntyre, and I think Joshua Levine is just doing a book on the SAS. So there's clearly still interest in special forces of all types, and of all the special forces, the one with the most unique kind of way of waging war, because it's not about going and blowing stuff up, it's about intelligence. It's got to be the unit we're talking about today, isn't it, in terms of the broad scope?
Yeah, and the thing with the period of their operations that we're talking about today is probably one of the most unique out of the whole entire war. You've got a naval officer and 11 Marines bouncing around the North African desert in 3 jeeps and 2 motorcycles, and this naval officer a few weeks before was in command of an MTB off the coast of France, dropping SOE agents. Wow. So it is just bizarre, and hopefully we'll really sort of pique some interest and tell people a new story today.
Indeed. So we've come on with a PowerPoint. Folks, we'll do questions as we go along, and it's not too many slides today because I guess there isn't a huge amount of imagery from that period because of the small number of men involved and what they were doing is kind of top secret. But I'm interested in learning, because it's, for most of us, I think, watching, it's going to be a pretty new information coming our way. So over to you, Dave. Just tell me when you want me to move on slides, and let's learn about 30 Commando in North Africa.
Yeah. Okay. So if we jump to the first slide. Just a bit of background for anybody who doesn't know anything about the 30 Commando, 30 Assault Unit. It was the brainchild of Ian Fleming, the James Bond author. And in March 1942, he produces this proposal for an intelligence assault unit, very much pinching the idea from the Germans. They used something very similar in particularly in Yugoslavia, and even in the 1940 campaigns, sending small specialist groups ahead of the main body of their troops to capture strong points, to capture important personnel, capture documents and all of that. And that information comes back to Britain. Fleming picks up on it and writes this, and he gets the support Admiral Godfrey, director of the Naval Intelligence, and through their connections, they managed to push this to be created in March 1942. And as our good friend David O'Keefe knows very well, the first outing as such is during the Dieppe raid. The first test for them is during the Dieppe raid. So yeah, that's a little bit of background. If we jump to the next slide, Woody. So the Dieppe raid is a failure in all respects. They don't manage to get to the target. They don't manage to get anything more than very wet and a bit of swimming practice. In November 1942, they are earmarked to be part of Operation Torch, and they were going to be sent alongside the US troops to storm Algiers harbour. Now, the photograph on the screen there known as the Algiers Six. Is those six men? They're all Royal Marines. They were part of the Dieppe raid. So they'd already done an attack on a port. They'd done something very similar that they were now being tasked to do again. All volunteered after Dieppe to join 30 Commando, and went on, as we'll see in a moment, to be part of Operation Torch. All of them, apart from one, served right the way through. The only one who left the unit is Marine Bradshaw. Brad Bradshaw there.
Mm-hmm.
Bradshaw actually won the military medal at Dieppe, but at the end of Operation Torch, he turned to one of his mates and said, "That's it, I've had enough," and just left the commandos, left the unit, left the commandos, and just went for a quieter life. And who can blame him, really?
Yeah, I was going to say, who can blame him? I mean, and you'll talk about this later on. We talked about it in the first time, is that World War II generated insane amounts of paperwork. I mean, the British, Americans, Germans are all producing stuff on a daily basis. And so harbors and military facilities and headquarters were generating paper, tons a month. And so when you're talking about finding intelligence, it's about the proverbial needle in the haystack, because you've got to sift through a whole lot of shit to find what's important, because you don't want to be looking through files of how many socks were ordered for the Africa Corps in April 41. You want to be finding the movement. So I know you'll explain this later on, but how do you tell people what's important to look for? And also, if you tell them about what you might be looking for, you're giving them information that if they get captured, people get out of them. So it's a balancing act, isn't it? You want people to be able to spot things, but don't want to tell them too much of what's going on. So if you want to explain a bit of that as we go along, that's what intrigues me about this whole thing, is being able to identify what's pertinent.
So, and it's interesting, all of the Marines, as well as the naval officers who were part of 30 AU. So 30 Commando was made up of Royal Navy, Royal Marines, and there was an Army section to it as well, 34 Troop. And they were all trained in various commando techniques, obviously, but things like cracking open safes. They were interrogation techniques. They were taught to identify documents. None of them were indoctrinated into the Enigma secret, into Ultra as such, apart from some of the naval officers. And it does appear as though they were fully aware of the situation. But I think that just shows the value that was being put on the Ultra secret, that these men who were indoctrinated were still being sent out there just because of getting the right information was so important, and the right equipment. And particularly still in November 42, when the four-wheel rotor machine has not been in very long, and Bletchley Park have only just received the capture from the sub off the U-boat off of the Alexandria. So it's still very much a dark period for Bletchley Park and Ultra. If we move on, Woody.
Yep.
So Operation Torch. As I say, they were on board HMS Malcolm, and the plan was that HMS Broke and HMS Malcolm, loaded with around 600 US troops that had never been in any form of combat. A lot of them were National Guardsmen, and a small party, this 6 Royal Marines and 1 naval officer. And their task was to steam full speed into Algiers harbour, break through the boom. The ships were reinforced on their bows to be able to break the boom that was across the harbour, pull alongside the dockside, storm the dockside, capture various points. And the small detachment from 30 Commando, they were to seize points. They were to seize the French naval headquarters. And if we jump to the next slide, I think we've got the map on there. So you can see on there that drawing was done as part of a US Army report in about 1947. So a report on the attack on Algiers, and you can see just coming into the harbour, you can see the 2 going into the Bay of Algiers, but the orange line points to where the French Admiralty building is. Mm-hmm. So 30 Commando had a bit of a trek, even if they'd managed to get on shore to get to there. But as it turned out, it wasn't a success. It was another Dieppe, if you like. There were frantic secret negotiations before Operation Torch to ensure that the French didn't resist. So there was all sorts of undercover work going on to make sure that the French would just sort of welcome the Allies with open arms, and there would be no fighting. Some parts of Torch went well, but in Algiers it didn't go very well. And as Malcolm and Broke were approaching the port, the town, which was full of lights, all the lights blaring away, suddenly went dark. Searchlights reach out to the ocean, pick out these two ships, and the batteries, which you can see on the high ground around Algiers, began to open fire on them. So this is around 4 o'clock in the morning. It's pitch black. Both of these ships are under heavy fire. Neither of them can make it through the harbor, through the boom in the first instance. So Broke circles around again, goes through. HMS Malcolm hit with some shells in its forward area, and boiler was damaged. Fires on board. So it's obvious that ship's not going to be able to make it. The captain of the Malcolm decides that he's going to turn away. The problem is you've got around 300 US troops and 30 Commando lying on the deck of HMS Malcolm, waiting to disembark as fast as possible. So there's a huge amount of casualties on there, and not only that, there's a huge amount of ammunition boxes and ammunition and so on that's on the deck. So that begins to catch fire, and two of the Marines, McGrath and Lofty Wyman, decide that pull out their Fairbairn scythe knives, cut the netting, and throw these mortar ammunition boxes overboard. It must have been hugely traumatic for these guys, because they'd experienced exactly the same thing not 3 months before, heading into Dieppe. The only difference was they'd been sat in landing craft at that point, whereas this time they were sitting on a destroyer. But the effect must have been absolutely frightening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh no, not this again. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And it must have. I guess the fact that they're sort of 18, 19, 20 years old means that they're not going to be completely disheartened and demoralized by thinking, oh, this is another failure, and still manage to go on. But you can see why Bradshaw, after all this, decided, that's it, I've had enough. I'm packing in. I want a cushier job than this.
And do we know what, if had they got to the Admiralty building, what it was they were looking for? Was it a pinch raid? Was it for Rotor Enigma stuff, or was it more information about Vichy France or politics, or was it a case of anything that was of interest?
So there's no documentation saying exactly what they were looking for, but it does appear that they did have a long shopping list from the Admiralty and various other things that included information on charts, on mines, on torpedoes, on the French Navy. The issue is that after everything calmed down and after an armistice is signed the following day, Curtis, who's leading the operation, learns that the actual naval building that they were due to try and attack was guarded by around 1,500 French Marines. So the chances of them ever being able to take it were pretty slim.
Wow.
And it's one of the failures of the Algiers raid, really, or the attack on Algiers, is that intelligence was poor. The French were expected to sort of see the stars and stripes on everybody's arm, see the stars and stripes flying from these two destroyers, and just accept them with open arms. And that didn't happen. Although, interestingly, Curtis had a conversation with some of the French officers afterwards, and they turned around and said that the resistance was more formal than real. Wow. So I think it was more for honor than to cause any real damage.
I mean, we'll be doing the show with Michael Nyberg later in the week about what the situation was in terms of Vichy, and it. I mean, it's really common. I mean, he manages to cut through the complications in his fantastic book "When France Fell," but the different factions there are French. There's kind of pro-Axis, pro-Allied, pro-American but anti-British. There's pro-British but anti-American. There's pro-Arab but anti-French. And it's all changing minute to minute. So although there are ambassadors and delegates in various places trying to get the information through to those who need it, it's changing minute by minute, and it's ridiculously complicated. So I can understand how in this case there was an intelligence failure about what to expect in Algiers, because generally that was the situation facing the whole of the torch planning, is that no one was really certain exactly who was going to be in charge and how motivated they were going to be.
Yeah, and so there was a huge question mark over that. But eventually, Curtis and his detachment do get ashore. They jump aboard HMS Bolulo, which was the admiral's flagship,
Mm-hmm.
and eventually land on a beach about 20 miles to the west of Algiers, and have to then yump in true Royal Marine style towards Algiers. Targets had then changed, obviously, because an armistice had been signed between the French and the Allies. So the French buildings were out of bounds. So next on the list was the Italian Armistice Commission, which was based there. So 30 Commando capture this. They capture a couple of NCOs and some men in there. Managed to grab some charts, some information. They find in one of the guy's pockets a folded up bit of paper that was basically the key to an Italian cipher that Bletchley Park hadn't managed to crack yet. So that was a find. But it's as innocuous as a folded bit of paper in somebody's pocket. So this is the level of detail these guys are going to find the intelligence. One of the Marines, McGrath, walks away with his first wartime souvenir as he borrows one of the Italian soldiers' beretta, and that was to become quite a thing for 30. They were named expert in armed looters by Godfrey at one point, Admiral Godfrey at one point, and that's what they were. That's effectively what they were. They were looters. So they borrowed an awful lot of things from the Axis. They borrowed a lot of things from the Allies as well. But they eventually make it to Algiers, and are allowed to search the German Armistice Commission in Algiers, which was based in the Hotel Aletti, which was later to become the officers' mess for Algiers. But within there, they come across something that Bletchley Park had not yet managed to break, and that was an Abwehr code and machine. So, although they didn't achieve their original objectives, the haul of intel from Algiers was significant, and that proved that this unit was useful, and that's why it then gets sent back in January 43 to continue. And it's probably why it managed to survive. I think if it had come back from Algiers empty-handed, I think it probably would have died a death, and they would have been split up. But Algiers, paved the way for the rest of the success.
Well, I think that's interesting, Dave, because when we've done shows on the channel about, for example, the raid on the Aquitint in Italy by the early British parachute forces, if you're trying to seize or blow up an aqueduct and you don't achieve it, or you do achieve it, it's a binary thing. You either have succeeded or you haven't succeeded in the mission. But when it's about intelligence gathering, there's whole series of primary targets, secondary, and providing you get something for the minimum investment. We're talking about a very small team of people being sent in. This isn't costing the British government millions. It's not like developing a new 4-engine bomber or something like that. It's a low expense, high potential, high reward exercise, isn't it? If they come back with something. And if you've got the right sort of resourceful people that, who think, okay, well, we haven't got target A, we haven't got target B, but target C looks interesting. Let's look at what we can find. You've always got the ability to make a result out of something. And
I think it seemed to be the resourcefulness of Curtis, Lieutenant Curtis, who was in charge of it, because that's what it was about. It was just about, right, there's nothing here. We need to go there. We need to find that. And they did come across a huge haul of significant intelligence that they found, and Curtis identified what it was and booked himself on a plane out of Algiers the following morning to get all this stuff back to the UK as fast as possible. Sadly, and I think he probably learned less in this, as he walked out of the room, he met a major from the field service police, told him about this. And when Curtis went back the following morning to collect it all, the major that had buggered off that night in a different plane and had headed home with it, stealing all the glory.
Okay.
So, I mean, end result, it all gets back to the UK, but it's just, not only are you fighting against your enemy, you're competing against the various other elements within your own force.
Wow, fascinating.
But as I say, January 43, the unit are ordered back to Algeria, and by this point the unit has expanded. There's a huge amount of training going on at their base in Amersham, which I talked a lot about in the previous video.
Yep.
And they're sent back. Curtis is now a lieutenant commander. His story is really interesting, and I've got to know his son very well. And Chris's son has provided a lot of the photographs within this slide. And Curtis is schooled at Eton, becomes a solicitor before the war, joins the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve, the Wavy Navy, ends up in coastal forces in charge of an MTB, and he takes part in the Saint-Nazaire raid. Now, his MTB was Commander Ryder's headquarters ship for the Saint-Nazaire raid, and it's one of the few that manages to make it in and out almost in one piece. But his other operations were basically dropping SOE agents off on the coast of France and picking them up again. So he had no land-based experience. He wasn't military trained at all. He was a very good sailor before the war, who managed to turn his hand to a bit of cloak and dagger stuff. And then when 30 Commando is formed, Captain Ryder VC takes over as CO, and he brings Curtis with him, who's one of DSC at Saint-Nazaire. But in charge of the Marines at that point was the gentleman on the right there, Peter Huntington-Whiteley. Again, Eton schooled, came from a very good family in the UK, the sort of the right sort of chap, if you like, for this sort of thing. Grandson of Stanley Baldwin, the ex-Prime Minister, the right sort of connections, the right sort of person. Joined the Marines because he didn't really know what else to do, and takes part in the Dieppe raid, is significantly injured in the Dieppe raid and doesn't remember anything until he sort of wakes up in the Haslar Royal Naval Hospital in Portsmouth, and writes to his sergeant asking basically what had happened and trying to piece together. But he was responsible for recruiting the Marines for 30 Commando. They nicknamed him Red because he had red hair. Referred to as a good officer, a gentleman. They all liked him. He was popular, had a wicked sense of humour, as we'll see in a moment. But he was really well liked. Continued to serve with the unit, but sadly was killed in action in Le Havre in September 44 while accepting a German surrender. But again, we talked about that previously. And
we did.
Yeah. But if we jump to the next one. So New Year's Day, 1943, 3 jeeps, 2 motorcycles, and party of around 20, detachment of around 20, head off from Amersham up to Glasgow, and jump aboard convoy KM F8 and head off down to Algeria. They were aboard the SS Durban Castle, and as the Marines were boarding, Red Huntington-Whiteley gives them all a boarding card. And on the boarding card, it says second class cabin. So you can imagine the Marines thinking, wow, this is brilliant. He's done it for us. What they didn't realize was that this was just one of his little japes, and they ended up in the very bowels of the ship where the refrigerators had once been. They weren't too pleased. But they did have because they were Marines, they were used to being on ships. They were used to manning guns on the ship. So they all volunteered or were volunteered to work on the anti-aircraft guns. So they worked alongside the gun crews. Now that meant they had better accommodation. They had to work watches, but it also meant that they got better food because they got watches. They got rations. So it made for a more comfortable journey down to Algiers. And the convoy suffered from some really bad weather, so it wasn't really troubled by any U-boats or anything until when the convoy reaches Gibraltar and heads into the Mediterranean. There's this real sense of ramping up the tension, because you've got clear skies, you've got calm seas, and you're obviously within easy reach of German aircraft. One of the Marines, Bon Royal, manning the guns, is asked by Huntington-Whiteley, where do you expect German aircraft to come from? So he thinks for a moment and works out where he is, and then points in the direction of Sicily. To which point one of his sergeant slaps him around the head, points up at the sun and says, "No, from there." So because that's where they were going to be coming from. So they land in Algiers, and they land in February 1943. So we jump to the next one, Woody.
Yep.
So this is one of the only photos I've ever come across of the men in Algiers at this time, or in North Africa. There's so few because, as you said, Woody, it's such a small unit. There weren't many of them there. They weren't meant to be taking photographs. It's I suspect some families had them and they've just been lost. But this is one of the few that's around, and this is, as I say, February 1943. So they've not long been off the boat. They're in the battle dress. They're in their newly issued green berets. And this is before the Jeeps get modified to head into the desert. In Algiers, they were there for quite a while. They weren't wanted there. Admiral Cunningham, who was naval officer in charge, didn't like these private navies, as he called them, or private armies, hanging around just waiting for something to do. So very quickly they had to get to somewhere else, which they do eventually. But while they're in Algiers, they just do some more training, and bizarre training for Marines. So 3 of them head off to the submarine depot ship, and they learn about the Davis escape gear, so that they can dive onto sunken ships or submarine, in shallow waters, go down, find out what's on these sunken ships. Some of them do Morse code training, fairly acceptable, you might expect. And one of the others is sent to work on diesel engines, but he's not sent to work on diesel engines on the vehicles. He's sent out onto an MTB to find out how diesel engines operate on a ship. Interestingly, with the signals, they had no signaler with them, and they had no formal radio equipment. So their only form of communication was a suitcase radio that they borrowed from MI6. And so that was it for their communication in Algiers. And it's this idea of almost making it up as they go along. We'll just cobble this together as we go. We'll work it out. Something will go right.
And I think we spoke about it in the previous show, David. I mean, the kind of people that would be attracted to this, they're obviously going to be, they have initiative, and they must just be interested in everything, because the more skill sets you have, the more you know about torpedoes, gun sights, telegraphy, maps. All of that information is useful in what they're trying to do. I mean, when we talk about some regular commandos, it's all about blowing things up and killing people, which is important and a very worthy part of winning a war. But like we said on the top of the show, the broad skills of being able to identify intelligence information, there's simply no end to what you could possibly find beneficial to help you. You know, anything, if you're walking around Algiers, anything is going to be of interest. You know, how people do that, how that works, how does this work? It's extraordinary how many facets that could be useful.
Yeah, and you know that all the Marines were given language lessons in German, in Italian, all of that. And you're right, some of them just soaked up as much information as they could, because it was available to them. You know, anything they wanted to learn, anything they wanted to find out about, they could. But if we jump to the next one, really please. So they set up headquarters in Bone, which is now Naba in Algeria, and they set up in a villa called the Villa Larry, about 5 miles outside Bone. Now, Bone is described as a hugely dangerous place because it's the main supply port for the First Army, which is massing in Algeria for the big push against the Axis in Tunisia. So it's a daily target for the Luftwaffe, and being slightly out of the town, out of the port, was safer, but it wasn't completely safe. So even although they're in this nice villa on the beach with tents on the beach, they are getting attacked on a daily basis. And Bone, because it was the supply base, because it was the hub, if you like, of everything, there were all sorts of, I suppose you'd call them, irregular units hanging around in there, and they tended to sort of congregate towards 30 Commando, and all these various irregular units would get together, and you can sort of imagine them swapping ideas. One of the groups there was the small scale raiding force. Right. And there's a photo of them there with one of their dories, and they were mainly responsible for dropping SOE agents and so on off on the islands in the Med. But again, 30 Commando worked on them, learned how to row the dories, operate out of them. The SAS turn up, the US Airborne turn up, Popsky's Private Army turn up, you know, and they're all there. They're all trying to do the same thing, but they're all trying to coordinate. But also, they're probably all trying to be top dog as well. So, you know, it must have been an interesting time.
Yeah, we've got as you mentioned, the First Army a minute ago. Trevor is asking, who officially was their parent unit in North Africa? Was it First Army G2, or was it the Royal Navy, or do they have many bosses?
So officially, they only answered to the Admiralty. Right. They had a letter of introduction from Combined Operations to the admiral in charge in Algeria, but it essentially was Curtis had to basically negotiate with every senior commander that he met, and had to explain what the unit was. So they were sort of operating outside of everybody's command, but had to sort of sweet talk their way in. And that's one of the things that Curtis was very good at. He ended up as a diplomat in the European Council and the European Commission. So he obviously was very good at that sort of thing. But yeah, the direct line came from the Admiralty back in the UK. Yeah, next slide, Woody. So they're hanging around in Bone. They're there for about a month. The First Army and 8th Army not having a huge amount of success. Montgomery's doing his usual of building up his forces and waiting for maximum advantage down in the south, in Tunisia. And it becomes obvious that 8th Army is going to be the most mobile. That 8th Army stand the best chance of getting to Tunis than 1st Army. And also, because 8th Army are going to be advancing up the coast of Tunisia, there are possibly going to be more naval-based targets there. So the decision is taken that 30 Commando will join up with 8th Army. Now, to do this, the jeeps have to be modified. So the jeeps are taken to the US Army Engineering Works at Constantine and fitted out just like you would imagine the SAS Jeep. So we've all seen the photographs of what the SAS Jeeps looked like when they were operating in the desert. That's what they were looking like. Extra petrol cans, sandbags in the bottom. They were fitted out, with camo nets, extra water, extra petrol. The one thing I haven't got to the bottom of is that one of the Marines who left a very good detailed memoir, Bon Royal, insists that the Jeeps were fitted with twin 30 caliber Brownings on the front, and then 2 pairs of 30 cals in the back, and that one of them also had a 50 cal fitted in the middle. Now that seems an awful lot of hard
That's a
work.
lot of firepower for an intelligence gathering unit. Yeah.
And they needed a lot of firepower. But looking at Curtis's handwritten diary, which Chris, his son, was very kind to let me have a copy of, he refers to when they go to Constantine, the Jeeps are fitted with mountings for the Brens. So I've got this dilemma as to whether or not they were fitted with, they just had sort of twin Brens, or whether they had 30 cals. Bon Royal goes into quite a lot of detail about them, but my gut feeling is it's too much. It's just too much weight for a Jeep to be carrying.
Yeah, I mean, if just the ammo alone, to carry enough ammo for that amount of machine gun, that's the Jeep full up before you even put any people in it.
Yeah. So, but it's really detailed, and he talks about it, them having sort of 240 rounds and it being on the canvas belts, and but it just doesn't fit. I'd love to have been able to ask that question to him and push that point.
Well, these are these things that are these challenges to try and find the solution to. That's why, people like yourself will never give up this, because there'll be these nagging things that you're still trying to be working out 40, 50 years later on your deathbed. And that's what keeps us going, isn't it?
Yeah.
Your final words will be, I never did resolve what the machine gun situation was on the Jeeps in North Africa.
Yeah. So 1st of April, it becomes obvious that 8th Army are going to move, and Gabez falls, I think, on the 31st of March. So Curtis makes the decision that they've got to get to 8th Army. The only way to get to the 8th Army is to head south and then east around the front line, because the front line is running north to south and then sort of out to the east to hit the coast. So they set off from 1st Army HQ, head down, cross over the front line at odd points, even, but they don't come across any German opposition. We go to the next slide, Woody. And then on the 3rd of April, they reach something called a Shot d'Igered, which is basically a salt lake, a huge salt lake in the middle of the desert. For any Star Wars fans out there, this is where the Skywalker homestead is filmed, on Tatooine. So this was used as the location for that, just to throw a bit of Star Wars trivia in. And along the way, they come across some French colonial troops who are just out there doing their normal job, not really, probably not unaware of anything that's happening. These French troops on their camels, and they explain to Curtis that the salt bed, because it's winter, is going to be impossible to drive over. It's going to be, it's got a bit of a crust on it, but you're going to sink into it. So they end up having to travel around it, and the photos there are just give you a sense of what the terrain was like that they were going through. And what you have to keep reminding yourself of is that this is a naval officer and about a dozen Royal Marines. It's not like the Royal Marine Commandos today who work out, who train in every sort of climate. These guys have never been to the desert before. They've never really, used any sort of transport. So they're really doing this without any experience or guidance. And that shows when one of the Jeeps gets stuck. So on the night of the 3rd, one of the Jeeps, which had been nicknamed the Pompey Privateer after the Portsmouth division of the Royal Marines, gets stuck. And Huntington-Whiteley comes up with the suggestion, well, we can use one of the camo nets, lay that underneath, that'll give a bit of traction to the wheels, and we'll get it out. So they unload the Jeep, lay down this camo net, sit in, turn the engine on, wheels spin, and what happens? The camo net just winds itself around the drive shaft and the axle, jams the engine. So Bond Royal is tasked with removing the netting. So he spends the night cutting away the netting with his knife. Huntington-Whiteley at this point decides that he's going to go off on a little jaunt. So he takes the other Jeep and disappears into the night. And he's gone. No one knows where he's gone. And next morning, he eventually reappears, and he'd spent the night with some French troops in a little outpost drinking wine. But Bond Royal finds that the only way he's going to get this last bit of netting out of the engine is to burn it off. So Curtis wakes up that morning to see smoke coming out of the engine of one of the Jeeps as Bond Royal burns off this netting. And again, it's that ingenuity we talked about. It's that make it up as you go along. It's that, oh well, I'll try this and see what happens. Thankfully, both Jeeps survive, and they manage to sort of head off. One of the sergeants comes up with a very clever idea of booby trapping the motorcycles, because the Arabs in the area, the Bedouins in the area were renowned for borrowing things and perhaps not returning them. When they camp for the night, Krutov decides that he's going to booby trap one of the motorcycles. So he ties a piece of string to the motorcycle, ties it to the pin of a grenade, with the plan that if somebody drives off on the motorcycle, they'll obviously pull the pin and the grenade will go off. After a while, one of his mates pointed out that if that happened, that the motorbike would be traveling off with the pin, and they'd be left with the grenade going off. So it perhaps wasn't the best way at stopping someone nicking a motorbike. Next one, please, Woody. Eventually, though, they make it across the Chott and head off through Kabylie over towards Gabes. Now, the first troops they bump into are the New Zealand division, and the New Zealand division are completely nonplussed about seeing a group of Marines with a white-capped naval officer coming from the wrong direction in the middle of the desert. Kiwis being Kiwis just accept that this is perfectly normal. And they break out the tea and they break out the fags, swap cigarettes, swap a few stories, and get pointed in the direction of the main body and the HQ for 8th Army. Now, they are the first unit to connect from 1st Army to 8th Army, and it's a journey of about 1,000 miles that they undertake in these 2 Jeeps, 2 motorcycles, but they are the first to connect the 2, which is quite an achievement for a Royal Navy unit operating in Jeeps. So they head and join up with the 51st Highland Division. And the general in charge of the 51st, General Wimberley, I think it is, again rather well connected and knows Huntington-Whiteley's family. So there's a moment of surprise as to who the hell are you? Bit of introduction, bit of who do you know? Oh, I know him. Yeah. What can we do for you? So Curtis says, explains their mission, explains what they need to do, and Wimberley gives them permission to operate alongside the frontline units of the 51st Highland. So this is the first time that 30 are operating in the role that they're expected to, which is ahead or alongside frontline troops to get to these places, get intelligence before it can be destroyed, before it can be destroyed by the Axis forces, but also before it can be looted by Allied forces, there's no point going into these places the next day or even a few hours later, because important things are going to have gone missing. So you have to be there right at the start. And this is the first time 30 operate in this role. And this is how they operate in Sicily, in Italy, and later in Northwest Europe, to great success.
And just worth mentioning, Dave,
Yeah.
you've been talking about this kind of freewheeling units in their jeeps, just basically bombing about in the desert up to this point now. This is happening concurrently with a very organized American, British, Commonwealth advance across towards Tunis. We'll be talking about that later in the series with Trevor Sheehan and Ian Mitchell. Battle of Longstop Hill, and it's interesting that at the same time there's a very organized, methodical war being waged with phase lines and army, and at the same time there's this group of people just kind of doing their own thing in the middle of it. It's a strange paradox that it's happening, and they're not even army. They're, as you say, they're navy. They're, as you said, they're the title of the show, Desert Sailors. It's extraordinary the different methods of war that are being waged at exactly the same time. One very rigid with rules and regulations, and one kind of freestyling, experimental warfare in a sense. It's fascinating.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting to see the contrast between 8th Army and 1st Army. 8th Army had been out there for a long time. They'd been there, done it, seen it, got the T-shirt, all the rest of it. So there was a little bit more of a relaxed attitude in there, which is why, this unique, odd-looking unit turning up doesn't really raise any eyebrows. Whereas in 1st Army, I think there was a little bit more wariness of them, because they were trying to do things properly. They didn't have that war experience that the 8th Army had, because these guys were. So Curtis they're all in battle dress, standard battle dress and so on. Curtis is there with a white topped naval cap, and as they're advancing, they start to fly a white ensign from one of their jeeps. So you've got this really odd looking situation of these jeeps racing through to get to the front, bypassing any troops that get in their way. So there's one of them comments on the fact that they go past this infantry engineering unit, gingerly sort of prodding for mines and so on, and the two jeeps just go flying past, and it's just that recklessness that fortunately doesn't end up with any casualties. And that's the amazing thing about 30s. There's so few casualties, considering they were operating on the front line. But they had their fair share of contact with the enemy. But because they were, the jeeps were heavily armed, whether it was 6 Bren guns or whether it was 6 30 cals, it's a hell of a lot of firepower to be able to turn on retreating troops, most of whom were Italians. The Germans at this point were very good at leaving the Italians behind, taking anything that could move and valuable, and just retreating back to Tunis. And that was one of the issues for 30, is that the Germans and the Italians had a long time to get ready for this retreat. So a lot of intelligence was destroyed or removed. So actually the intelligence haul probably wasn't as good as they'd hoped. But the situation was what it was. They couldn't do anything about that. Do you want to jump to the next slide, Woody?
Yeah, and Sean is mentioning the idea of the fear of friendly fire as well. And you talked about how the fact they bumped into the New Zealand unit from coming in the wrong direction. I suppose, given that it isn't a large force, people are going to be inquisitive as to who they are first. I would think that people will be, let's find out who they are before we open up. If you saw 20 half tracks and tanks coming at you at the wrong direction, you may be more inclined to open fire first and ask questions later. But I suppose this small force with jeeps, maybe that size was their benefit, is that people kind of looked at them and go, well, just give it a minute or two and find out who they are. Then you'd see the white ensign, or you'd see the battle dress, or you'd see the Allied marking somehow. But it's still it's balls of steel because as you said, you made the point, they're not only going to get there before the enemy have destroyed stuff, they've got to be there ahead of the Allies, because the Allies by this point have a habit of blowing up every town they get to make sure there are no Germans there. And if they're getting there after the town has been targeted by artillery, after it's been cleared of booby traps, the potential gains you're looking for have already gone. So you've got to be ahead of everybody. Crazy.
Yeah. They enter Suffolk there, and that's the building that was the German military headquarters, which was their target. And that's sort of, alongside elements of the 31st Highlanders. They're going in. I think it was one of the Dragoon regiments. 30 Commando are sitting on the back of their tanks, because you don't want to be going into these places in soft skin jeeps. So they're riding on the backs of tanks, going into there. And it's all these, the Hollywood movie stuff is right here. There is a huge story to be told out of this. If we jump to the next one, Woody, because I'm conscious of time and waffling, which I'm
That's good. We're loving it.
So eventually they end up at Sousse on the 12th of April, and Sousse is attacked by the elements of the New Zealand division, and again 30 Commando are in there as elements of the New Zealand division are still fighting the Italians. Now, because Sousse was an important harbour, the largest harbour on that side, it was identified as a supply base that could be used to keep the advance going further north. So Curtis, being the only naval officer around, is tasked not only with his job of searching the German and Italian headquarters, but also with doing a quick survey of the port to decide whether or not it could be used for supply ships. He does come across 2 German LCTs, half submerged, in the port, and photographs them. Sadly, I've never managed to find the photographs of them. But yes, alongside his day job, if you like, he's having to do his little extras of surveying this port and saying yes or no, you can use it to start bringing in supplies immediately. It's at this point as well they acquire an Italian truck, because the amount of intelligence that they're gathering now is too big for the 2 jeeps and the motorcycles. So they acquire an Italian truck so that they can carry that. So again, that gives you some idea of the amount of intelligence they're gathering. Not all of it important. I think some of the most important things they find are details of the minefields around Sicily, which obviously becomes vitally important for Husky.
For months later.
Some Italian codes and so on, but also some radar information for Italian radar as well, which again, all adds into the intelligence and planning for Husky later on. Sousse is all of the towns that get liberated, and often 30 Commando, and this happened in France as well. Often they were the first Allied troops into these places, so they tended to be on the receiving end of the celebrations from the crowds, which sometimes could hinder obviously their operations. But Sousse, there was a big liberation party. I think there was a big parade held, which I think there's photos of Monty sort of overseeing. But there was a big liberation party held on about the 13th of April, and one of the Marines described it as big eats, girls, and wine. And that's how he described the party. But Curtis notes in his diary that they actually felt almost like frauds, because they didn't feel like they'd done any fighting, which was interesting as well. They weren't just taking this celebration. They didn't really feel as though they deserved it, which was interesting. But on the 14th, the 8th Army is held up at I think it's Enderville. German resistance begins to stiffen, and it becomes obvious that 8th Army is not going to make it to Tunis first. That's the next most important target. So Curtis and his detachment have to then travel back to the headquarters at Beaune, take all their intelligence with them and send that off to Algiers. But they then need to head back to Beaune. And it's at this point that they first come across one of the biggest fans, in inverted commas, General Patton. Patton comes to hate 30 Commando and comes across them both in Sicily and in Northwest Europe, and is never very favourable. Has nothing ever favourable to say about them. Apparently they upset him in North Africa because they drove through the Kesserine Pass, and those of you who know, it wasn't a particularly glorious place for the US Army. So yeah, I think by heading through that, flying a white ensign at top speed, didn't get them on the good side of Patton right from the start, which may explain why he hates them further on. But I think,
to be fair, Patton had quite a long list of people he didn't like. So they're among plenty of others there. So it's not like if you were the only one on the list, that would be weird. But it's a big list. So
yeah, true. So they head back up to Beaune, and then planning is the next stage is Tunis. So if we jump to the next one, the attack on Tunis is going to be a lot more organized. So this is again highlights that difference between First Army and Eighth Army. Eighth Army are very happy to just let these guys operate what they need to do what you need to do, and that's fine. The attack on Tunis is going to be a bit more organized. So because of the amount of intelligence that's probably going to be there, because of the amount of competing organizations that are going to want this intelligence, this unit S Force is created under that gentleman, Colonel Strangeways, and this sets the model for the other theaters. So S Forces operate in Rome, and there's a T Force created for the final push into Germany in 1945. These forces are basically amalgamations of things like MI6, MWE, SOE, Field Service Police, RAF Regiment, all of these things that are going to need or want intelligence. And it's a way of sort of coordinating and corralling them so that they can be controlled and the maximum amount can be achieved. The problem is that they don't operate on the front line. This is a group of force that follows up, and sweeps in once all the enemy resistance has gone. And that doesn't fit with what 30 Commando are about. So Curtis fights tooth and nail to get special dispensation for them to operate on the front line ahead of S Force and be the first ones sort of into Tunis. So when we get to the final push, if we jump to the next one, Woody, please.
And it's worth mentioning as well that 43 is the era when all the independent forces, it's got a little bit out of hand, isn't it? Churchill's idea of taking the enemy, the war to the enemy in different ways of 1940 has become everybody's got their own army by late 1942, early 43. So it's kind of a bit, the Monty Python officer has to come in and go, stop it now, it's getting silly. And units start disappearing. The small scale raiding force, some of they don't all survive the Carl. They get morphed into other things. And by 44, 45, we've talked about it a lot. There are a lot less of these fringe units. They've been swallowed up and become far more regimental in structure and outlook, I suppose.
Yeah. And I think those that were successful, those who managed to achieve their objectives, were the ones that survived. And that's why 30 is one of those that survives. Okay, it morphs and it changes, it increases in size, but it effectively is the same thing it was when Fleming first had the idea.
Exactly.
So the final push on Tunis happens on the 7th of May. You can see on that document there a list of some of the targets for the Royal Navy Party, which was 30 Commando as part of S Force. They split into two sections. Huntington-Whiteley led the first section off, which raced into Tunis. According to Paul McGrath, who was interviewed by Nick Rankin, he claims that they were literally the first of the first. So they were the first of the first army into parts of Tunis. He tells the story of turning a corner into a square and being met by these cheering Tunisian civilians and celebrations. And he said on the other side of the square, you could see about a dozen Germans jumping onto these motorbikes and sidecars and just buggering off, in his words. So it was literally, that's how close things were. But Axis resistance at this point had just collapsed. There was some fighting, and there was some fighting while the celebrations were going on in one street. There was fighting, but it wasn't major combat going on here. It was more of a collapse, definitely. So Huntington-Whiteley's team arriving there, quickly followed later that day by Curtis's team, getting there, achieve what they need to do. Next day, they head off and drive past Eloina airfield, and as they're driving past, there's a burst of Spandau fire over their heads from coming from the direction of the airfield, from one of the buildings over there. So they quickly pull over, jump over, duck for cover behind this wall. And Huntington-Whiteley is really keen to take them on. He wants to, he wants some action. He's a Marine officer. He wants to get stuck in. McGrath, the Marine who's next to him, is a little bit more hesitant. It's just like, maybe we should just wait, maybe for some heavier support. But no, Huntington-Whiteley pulls the pin on a stun grenade, lobs it over this wall. McGrath lifts his Tommy gun, a couple of bursts over the wall. Both of them follow that, jump over the wall. Absolutely no one in sight. Absolutely nothing. All completely disappeared. Disappointment. Okay, let's carry on. Get back on their Jeep, and suddenly they hear marching feet, and coming around the corner further down the road is this column of Germans, and they took the surrender of over 250 Germans to a little group of 4 Royal Marines. But by this point, resistance had failed. But that's probably their biggest. That's their second largest capture of prisoners. But yeah, 250 surrendering at that point. It was
Wow.
But it just highlights, that resistance at this point had collapsed. It carried on for a few days longer. I think it's the 9th of May that Alexander signals Churchill, the shores of Africa are ours, something like that. But despite not necessarily finding huge amounts, it was still a big success for 30. This detachment, Marines, 1 Navy officer, and what they did have a petty officer signalman operating the suitcase radio, but they'd achieved far more than their size of their unit. There were only a dozen of them.
Yeah. It's punching above their weight. It's a phrase we've used a lot recently, and the fact, as you said, remarkably light casualties. And although they didn't get the kind of the holy grail of intelligence information, they proved that the concept was sound. They proved that they could get there ahead. They could act independently. The principle works. And as we've talked about later on, we could do it again in the future when they take it into the ETO proper in Normandy. It does pay dividends. So it would have been ridiculous to abandon something that is inherently working.
Yeah, and you're right. It is the same stuff. I've just noticed in the questions, Trevor asking there about what happened to the German Enigma machines in Tunisia. The issue was that the Germans, as I said earlier, they just had too much time to get everything out of the way, and were very happy to leave the Italians behind. The Italians were very happy to just surrender to the first Allied troops that they could, and it was on the target list. And they did eventually pick up what was known as a gamma wheel, which is one of the extra wheels for the 4-rotor Enigma. But because of the lack of any sort of reliable signals or communication, they were delayed in getting that. It wasn't until much later that Curtis got hold of this. And had that been found in April rather than in May, Bletchley Park said that that would have made a significant difference. So there were opportunities. They were finding things, and I talked about the Abwehr machine that they found in Algiers, that Bletchley Park had not been able to break up until that point. So SIGINT was the main role, and it's one of the reasons they were created, because of the fear of those introductions of the 4-rotor machines and that break in the Enigma decryptions that was happening at the time.
I mean, we've talked about it before with David O'Keefe and yourself and others, is that we can now connect the dots more with the benefit of 80 years and say, if a few more people had known about the importance of SIGINT, if a few more people had known about the rotor, the code books, maybe we could have got some of, or the Allies could have made some of these acquisitions earlier. Maybe they could have made some more use of it. But then at the same time, as we just talked about earlier, the more people that know that this is something that we're working on, the more danger there is of the Axis finding out that there's these gains being made. So it's a chess game. It's a complicated situation of the Allies wanting to gain advantage without letting the enemy knowing that they're getting an advantage. So it's a complicated thing to get right. And I'm sure, we can now say maybe there were some shortcuts that could have been made, and a few more people could have been briefed a bit more about something, and it would have sped things up. But that's closing the door after the horse has bolted, really, isn't it? But
yeah.
But anyway, you've got your thank you slides before we bring things to an end.
Yeah, just really important, I think, to say thank you to some people who've been really helpful. Chris Curtis there, son of Dunstan Curtis. I've got to know him quite well. Lovely gentleman, and his father didn't talk much about his wartime experiences, but fantastic, and has obviously allowed me to use some of the photos. Nick Rankin there, author of Ian Fleming's Commandos. I recommend that to everybody who wants to learn more about this unit. Ian Fleming's Commandos by Nick Rankin. It was the book that got me hooked on this unit, and that was about 13 years ago. So I've been stuck on it ever since. Nick Royal and Yolande Hodson, a couple of son and daughter of Bon Royal and Paul McGrath. David O'Keefe, you all probably know.
He was watching earlier. I think he's maybe teaching now. He was on a bit earlier, but he hasn't posted for a while. So
yeah, he's probably off doing his day job. Phil Mills, who's been a great researcher for me and has dug out huge amounts from the archives. And then, unfortunately, I don't know his real name, but Twitter handle is at Tunisia 1943. Was out there recently.
That's Trevor. That's Trevor there. That is Trevor. Trevor and he's got a question for you as well. So, did 30AU interrogate any captured Axis personnel, e.g., signal staff?
They didn't. The only interrogation that's recorded is they interrogated some Italian saboteurs who were trying to fix limpet mines to some of the ships in Bone Harbor. So they were, the classic frogmen in rubber suits, riding that had come in from a boat offshore. So that was the only interrogation that they were doing. There's no record of them getting hold of any signal staff, other than obviously some code books and cipher keys and things.
And a question from me is with how few people there are involved in this, I suppose the ability to be self-critical and look at what they can do next time and how can we change things. I mean, it can be done around almost a single campfire, can't it? I mean, it's not like a big concept of what are we doing with air interdiction where you've got air groups across 4 countries. This is one group of personnel who can sit and say, okay, what should we do moving forward? And if in your research, were there any particular things that they learned in North Africa? They said, okay, we must make sure we do this when we go into get deployed again, or is it more of a sort of a gradual learning curve?
No, they do. They are quite reflective on what they've done, and Curtis writes quite a detailed report afterwards. Sort of highlighting that they need to operate in this way, but there were just insufficient numbers. A group of 12 is too small to be doing what they needed to do. Right. Deficiencies in planning. They need much more effective planning, and that comes into play, particularly before D-Day. There's a huge amount of planning goes into the target selection and the target lists that they're going to be looking for in France. So they were very reflective, and it does later on cause some friction between Curtis and Fleming, because Fleming has his idea of how it should operate, and Curtis has a bit more practical idea.
Hands-on approach, yeah. So a couple more questions. Darren Little, who's grandfather and uncles was always involved in commandos. Have you contacted Mike Beckett at all, who's done the Commando Compendium?
Yeah, I liaised with Mike when he was writing it. So fortunate enough to help him sort of put together a lot of the 30A Commando and 30AU stuff. But that's a great book. Other ones that you can probably not see on the shelf behind me. I sort of try to highlight some of the ones. Nick Rankin's book, definitely. If you can get hold of it, the other Bible is called Attained by Surprise. It's basically a forgotten voices. It's the men in their own words as such, but it's very difficult to get hold of. I mean, if you do find one, it tends to be quite expensive. But that's one of the go-to ones, definitely. And then yeah.
So Darren is also asking, are the 30AU war diaries available to read? If so, are they in the National Archives?
They are. There are no war diaries for this period. The only one I've seen is Curtis's handwritten one, which he then just writes up into a report. So there's no official war diary. There's war diaries for 34 Troop, which is the army element that operates in Italy. And there are war diaries from, I think it's April or March 1944. But they are so bland. They're ridiculously bland. There is just no detail. And I think that's partly because their operations were so secret that it doesn't even make it into the war diaries. It's interesting to look through some of the archives. Cecil Hampshire was writing about 30 back in the mid 70s, and he contacts one of the senior officers, Glanville, and writes, will you participate? Will you talk to me about what you did? And Glanville writes back to him and says, without official permission from the Admiralty, from the Director of Naval Intelligence, I can't tell you anything. And then goes on to be very critical of the fact that the Enigma secret had been leaked, had come out in the book. So it's around that 1975 period when it begins to become public. But yeah, and you talk to people who went to the reunions, family members who sort of went to the reunions, and they talk about the men telling stories, or oh, do you remember when we went to this place? Yeah, but we can't say anything. But so there's all sorts of information that will probably never come out.
Okay, we've got a couple more questions. So Robin is asking about, did they ever cross? Oh, sorry, Paul Forrest and Robin, did they ever cross paths with a long-range desert group?
There's no record of them ever coming across. They certainly came across the SAS in Bone. The SAS was certainly in Bone. So I should imagine there's a huge amount of experience that was verbally passed over at that point, because I think even then it was obvious what they were going to have to do. But no, and I know that the SAS and LRDG were operating from 8th Army to 1st Army. So I know that units were going that way. But certainly 8th Army reported that 30 Commando were the first unit to make it from there, other than any sort of little raiding party. They were the first effective unit to make it, to join the two armies together.
Okay, thank you. And then the final one from Sean Brennan there. Was there much cross-communication between 30AU and signal units? Like, what should signal units destroy, where to find stuff, etc.?
I don't know on that one. That's an interesting one. I think the issue was that they were so focused in on what they needed to do, that other people were training them rather than them liaising or training with anybody else. The Marines, even the Marines were taught to identify what top secret German words were, what German documents looked like, what thing. Not given any reason why they would be important, but just, if you see this is gold. You must, if you see this, stop everything, and get this out of there. And certain things, if it was that A1 level of intelligence, that had to be got out ASAP by an officer and back to the UK as quickly as possible.
Okay. Well, we'll leave it there, Dave. If people have more questions for you, if they have any leads for you, or they want to share information, you can be reached on Facebook and the usual contacts and blah, blah, blah.
Indeed.
And other than that, good luck with the ongoing research. And we can next year perhaps we can do we've talked about doing a tour, you using me as a tour guide, and for people that want to follow 30AU through Europe, we're thinking of you're thinking of that, and that's what we're working on. So there's lots of things, lots of more projects ahead of us, I think.
Yeah, but thanks for having me on again, Woody. Absolutely delight to see you, and love talking about it.
Brilliant. So, folks, tomorrow we are off to Casablanca, spies, espionage, all that kind of stuff with Meredith Hindley. But other than that, thank you very much for watching, everybody. Thank you for your great questions. Thank you, Dave. And, folks, I'll see you all again tomorrow. Cheers, everybody. Bye.